Our colleagues in the House today are acting on H.R. 51, and there's an equivalent bill, S-51, the Washington, D.C. Admissions Act. And as somebody who represents a state just a few miles from D.C., I didn't want to let this historic day pass without saying a word about it. The bill would, as everyone knows, make Washington, D.C. the nation's 51st state. I'm proud to serve as an original co-sponsor of the Senate version led by my colleague, Senator Carper. The bill was introduced earlier this year after many previous efforts with a record number of co-sponsors, and I'm proud to say that statehood for D.C. is enjoying the largest support in years. The right to vote is the cornerstone of our American democratic society. Through free and fair elections, ordinary citizens choose the leaders and direction of our country, yet some 712,000 residents of the nation's capital do not enjoy the right fully. For too long, Virginia neighbors in D.C. have been denied their civil rights and subject to taxation without full representation in Congress, which is a founding principle of our nation. Virginians love history. So on May 29, 1765, Patrick Henry gave his famous speech before the Virginia House of Burgesses, encouraging the passage of the 5 resolutions commonly referred to as the Virginia Resolves to address the Stamp Act. The act that was passed the following day included 4 of his resolves. Everybody remembers the Stamp Act of 1765 levied an unfair tax on American colonies on paper goods, newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, legal documents. The Crown was worried about the content of those documents, and so they levied the tax. With his first resolve, Henry declared that Virginians should be entitled to, quote, all the liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities, close quote, that other British subjects enjoyed. He wanted for Virginians the same rights enjoyed by people living in Britain thousands of miles away. Well, Mr. President, I can't help but notice the parallel. We stand in the District of Columbia, the seat of our nation's federal government, not thousands of miles away, just across the Potomac River or just over the border in Maryland. Hundreds of thousands of American citizens don't enjoy the same, quote, liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities as those in Virginia, Maryland, or other states. In his third resolve, Patrick Henry stated, quote, the taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, who can only know what taxes the people can bear or the easiest method of raising them and must make themselves be affected by every tax laid upon the people, is the only security against a burdensome taxation and the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom without which the ancient Constitution cannot exist. To date, D.C. pays more in federal taxes per capita than any state. Its residents pay more in federal taxes per capita than any state, and more total federal taxes than 22 states. Yet for more than 200 years, the people of Washington, D.C. have been denied what Patrick Henry urged on the Virginia House of Burgesses as a reason for American independence. D.C. not only pays more capital federal taxes than any state, it's also subject to a higher degree of congressional regulation of its internal affairs than any other state. So it is both taxed and overregulated without representation. D.C. meets the 2 criteria that have always been the test of admission of a new state into the Union: sufficient population and demonstrated desire by the population for statehood. Congress used to establish minimal required populations for statehood. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, for example, incorporated territories into the United States in the upper Midwest and allowed that they could become states once their population exceeded 60,000. Well, there's no such statutory minimum today. All would acknowledge that D.C., because it has a larger population than both Wyoming and Vermont, and it's close to the population of the 2 Dakotas, is sufficiently sizable to be a state. And D.C. has demonstrated its desire to be a state over and over again by popular referendum. Most recently in 2016, a statehood referendum was supported by 86% of D.C. residents. So D.C. meets the traditional tests for statehood. Its people are both taxed and regulated by a Congress that does not include representatives who can advocate on their behalf. Finally, Mr. President, I support adding a 51st star to the American flag because it will show that we're still a thriving nation. We haven't added a state in nearly 70 years. This is the longest period in American history without adding a state. Adding D.C. as a state will show the world that America is still a confident and growing nation with our best days ahead of us, not a fixed, inward, and static nation with our best days behind us. So with that, I stand here today to call on my colleagues in the Senate to give full and fair consideration to H.R. 51, which will pass today in S51, and provide the more than 700,000 residents of our nation's capital the full and equal citizenship that Patrick Henry demanded in 1775 and that the rest of the country enjoys today. With that, Mr. President, I yield.